In today's video, we will be discussing Ted Bundy. Theodore Robert Bundy, also known as Ted, was born on November the 26th of 1946 to an unwed mother in Burlington, Vermont. He was also known by his family as Little Teddy. His childhood was not easy. His stepfather and his relationship was strained. He was shy and was bullied. According to the article, Does Ted Bundy's Childhood Hold the Key to His Madness by Kate Serena? Quote, for the first 3 years of his life, Ted Bundy would grow up believing that his mother was his sister and his grandparents was his mother and father. By some accounts, Bundy did not learn his true parentage until 1969, not too long before his killing spree began. Bundy attended Woodrow Wilson High School and graduated in 1965. According to the article entitled, So What Did Ted Bundy's Education Actually Look Like by Marissa Gainsbourg, quote, after graduating in 1965, he spent a year at the University of Puget Sound, a liberal arts college also in Tacoma. He transferred to the University of Washington in order to study Chinese in 1966, but reportedly dropped out 2 years later. It's during this time at UW that Bundy started dating a wealthy brunette woman from California, Diane Edwards, aka Stephanie Brooks, who had everything that he wanted: money, class, and influence. Biography.com reported many experts believe that their breakup, she dumped him supposedly due to his lack of motivation, explains why he chose and brutally raped, beat, and murdered victims who resembled her. Ted Bundy graduated from UW in 1972 with a psychology degree. Bundy desired a law degree, but couldn't get accepted into any of the prestigious law schools of his choosing, so he attended the University of Utah, where he met his girlfriend, Elizabeth, better known as Liz. They dated for 5 years, starting in 1969. It's during this time Bundy's killing spree began. Ted murdered numerous women from 1973 to 1978. According to the article entitled A Full Timeline of Ted Bundy's Crimes Starting at the Age of 14 by Rachel Page, quote, January 1974, Ted Bundy's first attack. Bundy's first known sexual attack happened in January of 1974. He broke into the apartment of Karen Sparks, a University of Washington student, while she slept, and beat her before sexually assaulting her. Though she was in a coma for 10 days following her attack, she survived, but has lived ever since with permanent disabilities. February 1974, Ted Bundy's first known murder. Roughly a month later in February, Ted's committed his first known murder. He broke into the apartment of Linda Ann Healy, another University of Washington student, beat her, and then abducted her. Her remains were later found at a Taylor Mountain site where Bundy left multiple victims. ABCNews.go.com article timeline of many of Ted Bundy's brutal crimes. Ted would go on to murder Donna Gail Mason, who was 19 and a student at Evergreen State College in Olympia. They never recovered her body. In April 1974, he abducted and killed Susan Elaine Rancourt, 18, a Washington University student. And then he would murder Roberta Kathy Parks in May 1974. She was age 20, an Oregon State University student, around 11 p.m. Later, he would claim to have raped and killed her at Taylor Mountain. He abducted Brenda Carol Ball, age 22, in June 1974 in Burren, Seattle. Later, her skull would be found at Taylor Mountain. During this time, Washington residents, especially women, began to be filled with panic and fear. Washington police were desperately searching for answers and researching religions such as Satan worshiping and witchcraft in an effort to find this unknown killer. Ted's murderous rampage continued. He abducted Janice Ott and Denise Naslin from Lake Samish State Park on July 14, 1974. He was so brazen he would abduct these women in broad daylight. With his arm in a sling, he would ask for help with rigging his sailboat to his car and introduced himself as Ted. Ted Bundy drove a 1968 Volkswagen Beetle. According to a Newsweek article, Where is Ted Bundy's infamous VW Bug now? You could see the car in person. His car is located at the Alcatraz East Crime Museum in Tennessee. This museum is not far from me, about an hour to be exact. I did not know this until doing my research for this video. I'm going to have to check it out. In October and November of 1974, he murdered Nancy Wilcox, Melissa Smith, Lori Aim. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. I have a time with these names. Sorry. And Debbie Kent, according to an Insider.com article entitled From Troubled Childhood to Electric Chair, the full timeline of Ted Bundy's life and murder spree. He abducted and murdered George Ann Hawkins on June 10, 1974. Her partial remains were found, but yet she remains listed as a missing person. Insider.com article, he attempted to abduct Carol Ann DeRoche while shopping. Bundy identified himself as a police detective and stopped her. She escaped. It was during this time Ted Bundy had moved to Salt Lake City, Utah. A few hours after Carol DeRoche's escape, he would kidnap and murder Debbie Kent. Her parents left their front porch light on ever since her disappearance. Bundy messed up and left a clue behind this time, a key that matched his handcuffs in the parking lot. According to a allthat'sinteresting.com article entitled Ted Bundy's Victims and Their Forgotten Stories. Bundy killed 5 to 8 women in Utah. It wasn't until August of 1975 he was first on the police's radar. Police noticed Bundy driving down a street in his VW Beetle with his lights off. He disobeyed the officer's command to stop, and they arrested him. Police found the gym bag, ski mask, ice pick, as well as handcuffs. He would use these items to kidnap and murder women. Liz, his girlfriend, became suspicious of Bundy. She called the police and reported her suspicions. After a profile was put out for the Midwest killer, he was released after his arrest, although police were still suspicious of him. He would sell his car in September of 1975, but the car was seized by police from the second buyer. DeRoche ID'd him in a lineup. He was jailed, but was later released on bond. In February 1976 was when Bundy stood on trial for DeRoche's kidnapping. He was found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in Utah State Prison. He would later be charged with Karen Campbell's murder and would be transferred to a prison in Aspen, Colorado. In 1977, Bundy escapes as he served as his own attorney. He would visit the library. He jumped from the second-story window and then escaped. The fall caused him to break his ankle after he would steal a car and break into a camping trailer. He was apprehended by police and went back to jail. This would not be the last of his escape attempts. Bundy was arrogant and brazen. He denied he was guilty and laughed in his interview. I'm including this interview, and I will link the full video in the description.
I don't like being locked up for something I didn't do, and I don't like my liberty taken away, and I don't like being treated like an animal, and I don't like people walking around and ogling me like I'm some sort of weirdo, because I'm not. No. You know, again, not in the context, I think, that you're speaking of. I think I stand about as much chance of dying in front of a firing squad or in a gas chamber as you do being killed on a plane flight home. Let's hope you don't.
But so you don't lie awake at night thinking about it?
Not a moment.
You are not guilty.
I'm not guilty. Does that include the time I stole a comic book when I was 5 years old? I'm not guilty of the charges which have been filed against me.
And the allegations?
And the allegations.
The rumors and the
I don't know all of what you're speaking about, Lucky. It's too broad and I can't get into it in any detail. But I'm satisfied with my blanket statement that I'm innocent. No man is truly innocent. I mean, we all have transgressed in some way in our lives, and as I say, I've been impolite, and there are things I regret having done in my life, but nothing like the things I think that you're referring to. I've been told that you know, the parents of these girls are fairly decent people. I don't know. And I really feel for them because apparently they've suffered an incredible tragedy in their lives. The loss of a loved one is probably the most extreme kind of loss you can suffer in this life. And I feel as much for them as anybody can.
You think about getting out of here?
Well, legally, sure.
On December 30th of 1977, Bundy escapes again. This time, he would go to Florida and continue his murder spree. He lost 35 pounds so he could fit in the vent above his cell, entered the room of a jailer, changed clothes, and walked out the door. Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house at 3 a.m. at Florida State University and murdered Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy while they slept. Both Margaret and Lisa were severely beaten and strangled to death. These murders occurred on January the 15th of 1978. Kimberly Leach was just 12 years old. Bundy abducted her and murdered her in 1978. She would be his last victim and his youngest. Bundy left 2 bite marks which would connect him directly to the murders. Bundy was finally captured on February 15, 1978, after a high-speed chase. He claimed to be a Florida State University student, 29-year-old Kenneth Meisner. The actual Kenneth Meisner notified police after being informed through the media that Bundy claimed that he was him. And he notified the police that this was not him. Bundy refused to ID himself. Bundy was charged with possession of a stolen TV, 21 stolen credit cards, which belonged to sorority girls, and resisting arrest. Bundy would call his girlfriend Liz while in custody. She went to the police and gave this information to the police in an interview.
Said he would answer any questions he could, and I asked him about the night that Brenda Ball disappeared, because he'd been with me and my family, and he left early in the evening, and then the next day was late to my daughter's baptism, and I asked him if that's where he'd been, and he mumbled something, and I couldn't understand the answer, and then he said, "It's pretty scary, isn't it?" And I said, "Yes." I asked him if he'd ever tried to kill me, and he told me at one incident that he did.
What was that?
Oh, I used to sleep on a hide-a-bed by the fireplace in the living room, and he closed the damper. I was drunk that night, and he closed the damper, and he put towels under the door, and then he left. And he told me that he'd been really trying hard to control this sickness, and that he'd been staying off the streets and trying to be normal, and that it just happened that I was there when he felt it coming on, and that he wanted to kill me that night.
What steps did he take to either attempt to kill you or not to kill you?
Well, he just was going to let me die of smoke inhalation, I guess. He did tell me, I woke up briefly, and he said, I'm going to go home and get my fan. The fireplace is backed up. And he left, and he didn't come back.
Do you recall what night that was, period of time?
I think it was in the fall of '73.
The fall of '73.
I think so.
Did he mention the specific time that he coordinate with you, the time of your meeting to any of this starting, or had it started prior to meeting him?
Well, I asked him, I told him that the police were talking about murders that had happened since 1969, and I said that's the year that we met each other. And I asked him what I had to do with this whole thing, and he said nothing, that he had been trying to control it for years, and that we just happened to be together when it got the best of him. I told him when we were talking about the year 1969 being the starting date, he said that the police were years off. And he talked about, I believe he said that during 71, 72, and 73, it was taking up more and more of his time that he should have been using for other things. He told me it wasn't me, that it was him that was sick. It wasn't anything I'd done. I asked him, I mentioned that there was a phone call that he made to me from Salt Lake City when a woman down there was abducted, and it was late at night, and I've always thought, well, he couldn't be out abducting women, because I'd talked to him on the phone that night, and I asked him if he didn't sometimes call me or come over to touch base with reality after he'd done some of these things, and he said that's a pretty good guess.
Did he mention any other specific cases besides Brenda Ball and Lake Sammamish? Like, did he mention Central Washington State College, Ellensburg, Oregon State University girl?
No.
It was at this time police began to piece together who he was and what he had done and indicted him. I am adding this video to this video, and I am linking where I got the video for the full video at the in the description.
What do we have here, Ken? Let's see. Oh, it's an indictment, all right. Why don't you read it to me? You're up for election, aren't you?
Mr. Bundy?
You got it, didn't you?
Mr. Bundy?
You told me that you were going to get me. You said he was going to get me. Okay, you've got the indictment. It's all you're going to get. Let's read it. Let's go.
Theodore Robert Bundy, you are charged, indictment, 2 counts burglary, 2 counts murder in the first degree, 3 counts attempted murder in the first degree. Design or intent to effect the death of said Lisa Lee.
My chance to talk to the press.
Contrary to section 78204 Florida statute.
I'll plead not guilty, right?
Ted Bundy had a public defender acting on his part. This public defender went to Bundy and was concerned for his life, so he wanted him to enter a plea deal where he would take a life sentence and plead guilty. And Bundy agreed. And then, once they showed up for court, he stood in front of the judge with the courtroom packed and said that he was not going to accept this plea and that he felt that it was ineffective at counsel because his counsels and the prosecution believed he was guilty. So he rejected the plea deal. Bundy's trial began in 1979. Bundy had 4 public defenders, and Bundy himself was part of his own defense. He was so arrogant and cocky, it's unreal. He thought that he could get away with these murders and be freed because he was so smart and slick. This wasn't the case. He would argue about his living conditions in his cell. He would cross-examine witnesses about what the crime scene looked like. This is because murderers love to relive their crimes, and he was bringing out the gore. Women would flock into court and was mesmerized by him. Bundy was charming, well-educated, and good-looking. Bundy was unwell and even contested his own counsel after he had questioned the prosecution witness, discrediting her. The attorney walked out and quit. The jury would find him guilty, and he would receive the death penalty for the murders of Margaret Bowman, Lisa Levy, and Kimberly Leach. Ted had another trial for the murder of Kimberly Leach. During this trial, he had his girlfriend, Carol Boone, as a character witness. After she testified, he asked her to marry him in court, and she said yes. He would be convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, again, for the murder of Kimberly Leach. He would marry Carol Boone, and they would have a child together while he was on death row. He would eventually admit to the killings in interviews. He stated pornography contributed to his murder spree.
30 in the afternoon. You are scheduled to be executed tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock if you don't receive another stay. What is going through your mind? What thoughts have you had in these last few days?
Well, I won't kid you to say that it's something that I feel that I am in control of or something that I've come to terms with, because I haven't. It's a moment-by-moment thing. Sometimes I feel very tranquil, and other times I don't feel tranquil at all. What's going through my mind right now is to use the minutes and hours that I have left as fruitfully as possible and see what happens. It helps to live in the moment in the essence that we use it productively. So right now I'm feeling calm, and in large part because I'm here with you.
For the record, you are guilty of killing many women and girls. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes, that's true.
Ted, how did it happen? Take me back. What are the antecedents of the behavior that we've seen? So much grief, so much sorrow, so much pain for so many people. Where did it start? How did this moment come about?
That's the question of the hour, and one that not only people much more intelligent than I have been working on for years, but one that I've been working on for years and trying to understand. Is there enough time to explain it all? I don't know. I think I understand it, though. Understand what happened to me, to the extent that I can see how certain feelings and ideas developed in me to the point where I began to act out on them. Certain very violent and very destructive feelings.
All right, let's go back then to those roots. First of all, you, as I understand it, were raised in what you consider to have been a healthy home.
Absolutely.
You were not physically abused, you were not sexually abused, you were not emotionally abused.
No, no way. And that's part of the tragedy of this whole situation, is because I grew up in a wonderful home with two dedicated and loving parents, one of 5 brothers and sisters. A home where we as children were the focus of my parents' lives, where we regularly attended church, 2 Christian parents who did not drink, they did not smoke, there was no gambling, there was no physical abuse or fighting in the home. I'm not saying this was Leave It to Beaver.
It wasn't a perfect home.
Well, no, I don't know that such a home exists, but it was a fine, solid Christian home, and nobody, I hope no one will try to take the easy way out and to try to blame or otherwise accuse my family of contributing to this, because I know, and I'm trying to tell you as honestly as I know how, what happened, and I think this is a message I want to get across. But as a young boy, and I mean a boy of 12 or 13, certainly, that I encountered outside the home again, in the local grocery store, or the local drugstore, the softcore pornography, what people call softcore. But as I think I explained to you last night, Dr. Dobson, in an anecdote, as young boys do, we explored the back roads and sideways and byways of our neighborhood, and oftentimes people would dump the garbage and whatever they were cleaning out of their house, and from time to time we'd come across pornographic books of a harder nature than more graphic, you might say, more explicit nature than we would encounter, let's say, in your local grocery store. And this also included such things as, let's say, detective magazines and more hardcore.
Those that involve violence. Then.
Yes, yes, yeah. And this is something I think I want to emphasize is the most damaging kinds of pornography. And again, I'm talking from personal experience, hard, real personal experience. The most damaging kinds of pornography are those that involve violence and sexual violence. Because the wedding of those two forces, as I know only too well, brings about behavior that is just too terrible to describe.
Now, walk me through that. What was going on in your mind at that time?
Okay, before we go any further, I think it's important to me, and that people believe what I'm saying, to tell you that I'm not blaming pornography and not saying that it caused me to go out and do certain things. And I take full responsibility for whatever I've done and all the things that I've done. That's not the question here. The question and the issue is how this kind of literature contributed and helped mold and shape the kinds of violent behavior.
It fueled your fantasies, didn't it?
Well, in the beginning it fuels this kind of thought process. Then, at a certain time, it's instrumental in what I would say crystallizing it, making it into something which is almost like a separate entity inside. And at that point, you're at the verge, or I was at the verge of acting out on these kinds of thoughts.
Now, I really want to understand that. You had gone about as far as you could go in your own fantasy life with printed material, and you made or printed and video or film
photos, magazines, what have you. Yeah.
And then there was the urge to take that little step or big step over to a physical event.
And it happened in stages, gradually. It doesn't necessarily, not to me at least, happen overnight. My experience with, I'd say, pornography generally, but with pornography that deals on a violent level with sexuality, is that once you become addicted to it, and I look at this as a kind of addiction, like other kinds of addiction, I would keep looking for more potent, more explicit, more graphic kinds of material. Like an addiction, you keep craving something which is harder, something which gives you a greater sense of excitement, until you reach the point where the pornography only goes so far. You reach that jumping off point where you begin to wonder if maybe actually doing it will give you that which is beyond just reading about it or looking at it.
How long did you stay at that point before you actually assaulted someone?
Well, yeah, you see, that is a very delicate point in my own development, and we're talking about having reached the point or a gray area that surrounded that point over a course
you don't remember
of years.
How long that
was? Well, I would say a couple of years. And what I was dealing with there were very strong inhibitions against criminal behavior or violent behavior that had been conditioned into me, bred into me in my environment, in my neighborhood, in my church, in my school. Things which said, no, this is wrong. I mean, even to think of it is wrong, but certainly to do it is wrong. And I'm on that edge, and you might say, the last vestiges of restraint, the barriers to actually doing something were being tested constantly and assailed through the kind of fantasy life that was fueled largely by pornography.
Do you remember what pushed you over that edge? Do you remember the decision to go for it? Do you remember where you decided to throw caution to the wind?
Again, when you say pushed, I know what you're saying. I don't want to
Yes,
infer again.
I understand that.
That I was
point
that I was
is
some
clear.
helpless kind of a victim, and yet we're talking about an influence that is the influence of violent types of media and violent pornography, which was an indispensable link in the chain of behavior, the chain of events that led to the behaviors, to the assaults, to the murders, and what have you. It's a very difficult thing to describe. The sensation, of reaching that point where I knew that it was like something had, say, snapped, that I knew that I couldn't control it anymore, that these barriers that I had learned as a child, that had been instilled in me, were not enough to hold me back with respect to seeking out and harming somebody.
Would it be accurate to call that a frenzy, a sexual frenzy?
Well, yes, that's one way to describe it. A compulsion, a building up of this destructive energy. Another factor here that I haven't mentioned is the use of alcohol. But I think that what alcohol did, in conjunction with, let's say, my exposure to pornography, was alcohol reduced my inhibitions. At the same time, the fantasy life that was fueled by pornography eroded them further.
In the early days, you were nearly always about half drunk when you did these things. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
Was that always true?
I would say that was generally the case, almost without exception.
All right, if I can understand it now, there's this battle going on within. There are the conventions that you've been taught. There's the right and wrong that you learned as a child. And then there is this unbridled passion fueled by your plunge into hardcore violent pornography. And those things are at war with each other.
Yes.
And then with the alcohol diminishing the inhibitions, you let go.
Well, yes, and you can summarize it that way, and that's accurate, certainly. And it just occurred to me that some people would say that, well, I've seen that stuff and it doesn't do anything to me. And I can understand that. Virtually everyone can be exposed to so-called pornography, and while they're aroused to it to one degree or another, and not go out and do anything wrong.
Well, addictions are like that. They affect some people more than they affect others.
Well,
but there is a percentage of people affected by hardcore pornography in a very violent way, and you're obviously one of them.
That was a major component, and I don't know why I was vulnerable to it. All I know is that it had an impact on me that was just so central to the development of the violent behavior that I engaged in.
Ted, after you committed your first murder, what was the emotional effect on you? What happened in the days after that?
Well, again, please understand that even all these years later, it's very difficult to talk about it, and reliving it through talking about it is difficult, to say the least. But I want you to understand what happened. It was like coming out of some kind of horrible trance or dream. I can only liken it to after, I don't want to over-dramatize it, but to have been possessed by something so awful and so alien, and then the next morning wake up from it, remember what happened, and realize that basically, in the eyes of the law, certainly in the eyes of God, you're responsible. to wake up in the morning and realize what I had done, and with a clear mind and all my essential moral and ethical feelings intact at that moment. Absolutely horrified that I was capable of doing something like that.
You really hadn't known that before?
There is just absolutely no way to describe, first, the brutal urge to do that kind of thing, and then what happens is once it has been more or less satisfied and recedes, you might say, or spent, that sense, that kind of energy level recedes, and basically I became myself again. And I want people to understand this too, and I'm not saying this gratuitously because it's important that people understand this, that basically I was a normal person. I wasn't some guy hanging out at bars or a bum, or I wasn't a pervert in the sense that, you know, people look at somebody and say, I know there's something wrong with him, and just tell. I mean, I was essentially a normal person. I had good friends. I led a normal life, except for this one small but very potent and very destructive segment of it that I kept very secret and very close to myself and didn't let anybody know about it. And part of the shock and horror from my dear friends and family years ago when I was first arrested was that there was no clue. They looked at me and they looked at the all-American boy, and I mean, I wasn't perfect, but I want to be quite candid with you. I was okay. I was. The basic humanity and basic spirit that God gave me was intact, but unfortunately it became overwhelmed at times. And I think people need to recognize that it's not some kind of those of us who have been so much influenced by violence in the media, in particular pornographic violence, are not some kinds of inherent monsters. We are your sons and we are your husbands. And we grew up in regular families. And pornography can reach out and snatch a kid out of any house today. He snatched me out of my home. It snatched me out of my home 20, 30 years ago. And as diligent as my parents were, and they were diligent in protecting their children, and as good a Christian home as we had, and we had a wonderful Christian home, there is no protection against the kinds of influences that are loose in a society that tolerates.
You feel this really deeply, don't you? Ted, outside these walls right now, there are several hundred reporters that wanted to talk to you.
Yeah.
And you asked me to come here from California because you had something you wanted to say. This hour that we have together is not just an interview with a man who's scheduled to die tomorrow morning. I am here and you're here because of this message that you're talking about right here. You really feel that hardcore pornography and the doorway to it, softcore pornography, is doing untold damage to other people and causing other women to be abused and killed the way you did others.
Listen, I'm no social scientist, and I haven't done a survey. I mean, I don't pretend that I know what John Q. Citizen thinks about this. But I've lived in prison for a long time now. And I've met a lot of men who were motivated to commit violence just like me. And without exception, every one of them was deeply involved in pornography, without question, without exception, deeply influenced and consumed by an addiction to pornography. There's no question about it. The FBI's own study on serial homicide shows that the most common interest among serial killers is pornography.
Yeah, that's true.
And it's real. It's true.
Ted, what would your life have been like without that influence? You can only speculate.
Yeah. Well, I know it would have been far better, not just for me, and it's, excuse me for being so self-centered here. It would have been a lot better for me and lots of other people. I know that. Lots of other innocent people, victims and families.
Bundy is one of America's most notorious serial killers. He was charming, well-educated, and good-looking, but he was a con man. He'd murdered numerous women who were innocent. During his interviews, while explaining his killings, his eyes would go from blue to dark. He would claim he was drunk, had a battle going on within, an addiction to pornography that contributed to his acts. But he also stated in the interview that he took full responsibility for his actions. He was executed by the electric chair in 1989. His mother grieved herself as she stated she didn't raise him that way and she didn't understand. So not only did he ruin the lives of his victims and their family, but he devastated and destroyed his family. I can only imagine what his mother went through. Your thoughts? Put them in the comments below. Subscribe and hit that notification bell for more content. Thank you for watching.